So we're at our first fundamental checkpoint, and this is a very important checkpoint because it makes sure that there is no key gap or weakness that's going to be holding us back from moving on to the later stages. When we move into the later stages, we need to have a very, very strong foundation. Otherwise, errors will appear all over the place, and it's often very difficult to figure out where the errors are occurring. And most of the time, by the time we know the error has occurred, it's already been like weeks or even months since the error's initial onset before it really starts manifesting. And it took us a long time to figure out and track back where these errors were coming from and realize it's a problem with, some fundamental aspect. And that's part of where this fundamentals course actually came from. I'll be going through the major components that we should have relatively down and confident with a reasonable level of competency and comfort with, lots of C's. And I'll talk about the relative importance of each of these parts so that you can make a judgment for yourself about whether you're ready to move on. There are some components that if you haven't done it or you haven't experienced it or if you haven't practiced it yet, that's going to cause a huge issue, and it's a big red flag. But then there are certain components that if you're not really super comfortable with it yet, we can potentially just continue working on that in the later stages, and maybe would say, hey, by now, if you haven't sorted that out, it's a big issue. But I'll explain the differences as we go through it. And we'll also take a look at some examples of work. So if you've got your own work, I would recommend actually having it out in front of you right now. So feel free to pause this, go grab that and have it in front of you so that you can actually compare what you're doing with the things that I'm saying to make sure that it ticks all of the boxes. The first thing that we need to make sure that we have sorted 100% is that we have actually practiced the techniques. Now, there is a surprising number of people that will go through the course and get to this point, and they've never really actually practiced using the techniques that they've been taught. One of the most common reasons for that is because they may have heard of a similar or related technique, or they may have heard of sort of one technique and they've used it in the past, or they either didn't find that it was effective or something. But there's some really important things that we need to understand about this. It's quite nuanced. Is number one, what we're trying to do is build a system. And even if you can do a single technique by itself, it may be very difficult to do that when you have, let's say, 3 or 4 other techniques that you're using simultaneously. And that's very, very common to find that individual techniques can be fine, but then when we put them into a system, the techniques start breaking down. So we need to have experience using at least most of these fundamentals in one go. Another, I find a little bit of an odd but common reason for people not to practice is that they may hear of a technique and they may have never really heard of trying this before. And as a result, they may think that it's not relevant for them because they've never heard of it, which I'm not completely sure about the logic there, but I've heard quite a number of students actually say that. So I'm saying it for you right now is that if that's the case and you're selectively learning some of these techniques, please don't do that. And the third thing is if you are wanting to learn more techniques to get more and more certainty about how to do the technique. You may not be applying the technique because you're not sure exactly how to use it, and you're thinking if you learn some of the later stages, you'll get a better idea about how it all fits together, and therefore you'll be able to be in a better position to actually start practicing and applying it. I'm going to tell you straight off the bat that is completely not going to happen. If you go further, your confusion will only grow because there are certain nuances and assumptions that we are going to be making about you and your level of technique and your experience. We are going to assume that you've tried some of these techniques. We're going to assume that you know how it works. We're going to assume you know how it, the most important one here, we're going to assume you know how it feels when you apply a certain technique and the type of cognitive load that it introduces, the type of discomfort it creates. We actually need you to feel the uncertainty and the not being sure and still trying it anyway, and then seeing how that feels and how it works for you. And we need you to actually do that a few times, because only when you've had that experience of managing the discomfort, as well as actually trying techniques that you're not 100% sure about, but doing your best, feeling some of the limitations, feeling some of the strengths that and benefits it provides, and having all these questions, that actually primes you to being able to learn the later stages much more easily with a lot less error, and is incredibly consistent. Like to a near universal level of consistency. When people aren't practicing the techniques by this point, the later stages are really an absolute mess. Like we have people that are nearly finished the course whose technique level is worse than someone who is at this stage at the end of fundamentals. And it's tragic, and they're usually really demotivated, and there's nothing we can do at that stage. It's a waste of everybody's time. Because these students will have to go and start the course all over again from scratch, but now they have to do it 3 times slower because they have to be extra careful about what they mislearned the first time around. So please, 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 please do not make that mistake. I have people always messaging me saying, hey, Justin, it's not clear that you're not meant to rush the course. And I just really, at this point, I do not think it's possible for me to make it any clearer. We need to be practicing, and if you're not practicing the techniques before you move on, it's not going to work out well for you, right? I'm going to say it this time once, make it a really big point here in the fundamentals, and I'm not going to belabor it in the later stages just because this is like the, time opportunity for me to just really, really reinforce it. So let's move on to the main things, the criteria that we need. The first one was actually having an experimental mindset. We need to get used to managing that discomfort. So by now, you should have had at least, let's say, 4 or 5 separate occasions and experiences where you have learned a technique, you've tried to apply it, maybe you weren't sure, you felt some uncertainty, you felt some confusion, and you were trying to figure it out. You were really like a scientist experimenting with this and trying to figure it out and using your results and figuring out how you can get those marginal gains. That mindset is incredibly important as a fundamental. So that's number 1. We need to make sure that we've got that. And that is something that if we don't have yet, I strongly recommend that we do not move on until we have that. Mistakes that you make now are low risk, almost no risk, really. But if we hold off on that and only start making those mistakes when we're halfway through the course, that is just, it's really, really messy and very time costly to start fixing that. And it's just the worst position to be in outside of just not being on the course at all. And in fact, actually, some students say that they would rather have not been on the course because they get to a position where they now know that their old techniques are wrong, but they feel incapable of doing it correctly because it's so overwhelming and they don't even know where the errors are because there are hundreds of places that the errors could be. Here, if there's an error, there's only like 6-7 places that you're likely to make an error. So if we can fix those 4 or 5 really important ones and the important mistakes that you make before you move on, that in itself stops that error from becoming, 20, 30, 40, 50 other errors later down the line. So that's the first point. The second one is that we want to have a level of experience with just trying to reduce the wordiness. Different people come into this course at different stages and with different techniques. Some people are very, very wordy and very linear with their note taking. Some people have an entire system built around just typing notes out or using apps like Notion or something else. And some people already come in with a little bit more of a refined technique that doesn't rely on such a linearity. And so it's really hard for me to know on like a pre-recorded video to know exactly where you are. This is a judgment you have to make for yourself. We have to reduce the amount of words that we're using. We need to try to get some experience, number 3, with writing some notes non-linearly, trying to show some of those relationships, trying to use a little bit more visualizations. And it's really important because relationships are incredibly important, and trying to represent and express relationships through words is very, very lengthy and tedious. Like, if you had 5 concepts and relationships between all 5 of them, it might be like a whole 3-page essay just to explain comprehensively and in detail what those relationships are. And in 99% of the cases, people are not even going to be willing to do that. They just don't even think about that because it just seems too overwhelming because they're so used to seeing things and thinking about things in terms of linear notes. So what we need to do is make sure that we are moving away from that. We're understanding how we can actually start expressing some ideas through arrows and things on a page occupying different places in space, and start breaking into some level of non-linear note-taking. It doesn't need to be amazing, but we need to start just getting a little bit more comfortable with expressing things without writing out full sentences and paragraphs all of the time and relying heavily on bullet points. Number 4, and related to that, we should have some level of grouping and categorizing of information. This is really important, and it's actually probably one of the most overlooked steps. People get so focused on the relationship side that we forget about just the fundamental step of taking those relationships and starting to bring some of them together to see how can I take these 3 items and actually group them. Because they share really similar relationships. And trying to just simplify and categorize and group some of this information, this is a really critical skill that leads on to more advanced chunking techniques later on. But if we're not used to just the idea and habit of grouping information, it's going to be a very uphill slope to learn the more advanced techniques. Everything that I've said so far up until now, these are things that would be red flags if we don't have at least some level of experience and a little bit of comfort and competency with doing. A little bit of nonlinear note-taking, trying to reduce our words a little bit, trying to show relationships, trying to group some information together, and being experimental in our mindset. If we don't have that to some level of comfort, even a little bit, just like starting to get used to it, then I would not move on until we get to that point where we are a little bit more used to it. The couple other things, so for example, exam revision techniques, your in-class technique, the spaced interleave retrieval, even if you don't have heaps of experience with this yet, that's something that we can just continue to work on for the next few stages. I definitely think we need to start implementing that, especially something like spaced interleaved retrieval. People can do the spacing really well, but they often don't do the interleaving very well. So just getting a little bit of experience with that so that we can actually start addressing that later on and refining it even further. But I understand that it's a little unfair to hold you back just because of that, when spacing by virtue is something that actually takes like weeks or sometimes even months to actually start getting really good at it with proper interleaving. As long as you're just making a start and you're intending to do that, I'm happy enough with that to leave it as it is. Things like in-class technique or exam technique and things like that, again, these are the sorts of things that you may not have the experience to really engage in quite yet, so I'm happy for us to continue working on that later. So let's now have a look at some of the work that's been produced by some other students and see where your work stacks up against this. And I'll sort of narrate and go through what I'm seeing, and you can have a look at your own work to see whether it fits in or not. So this is some work that was sent through by a student that is going through fundamentals. And so let's see, is this person ready to move on to briefing or not? And it's going to be subjective. If they're not comfortable with it, then, we don't need to push it. It's pretty hard to go too slowly and it's really easy to go too fast. So we keep that in mind. But we can see that they're demonstrating relationships. They've got some of this basic grouping of information that we can see here. And we can also see that they are representing information non-linearly. They're trying to cut down on their words. They're using some images here. They occasionally copy-paste images, which is not the best thing to do because the work involved in trying to think of the images can be quite challenging, and that in itself helps with the learning. But overall, it's looking really, really good, and I'd be happy based on this for them to move to fundamentals. The one thing that I'm not liking is that they're typing this out. They're doing all of this digitally, and it's a lot better to do to not type it and to actually write it. In these early stages, we're not going to see the benefit of writing it by hand. It just seems like an unnecessary additional step. But when we start transitioning these techniques into something that's more advanced, we'll find that just typing it actually limits us in a lot of ways and reduces cognitive load in levels that we don't want, that can negatively impact on our learning. So we do want to get into the habit of just doing it freehand wherever possible. This is another work that's sent by the same person, and we can see that there's relationships, there's non-linear aspects, it's not too wordy. There is a lot of copy pasting going on. So again, that's not the best. It creates an illusion of good notes sometimes because we feel good because we've got all this information on here, but actually it's copy pasted. So we may not have actually processed it in our brain, and we may therefore not really hold on to it very well. But this is again something that they can probably just work on as they progress through the other stages. It's not something that I'd say needs to hold someone back because they are trying to cut down on their words. They are experimenting with visuals. It's relational. There's some grouping going on. Now, there's lots of things that we can work on. It doesn't have great flow. It's a little messy. It's a little bit hard to follow. They're going to find that it might be a little bit time consuming. They may feel overwhelmed, but these are all normal things to face in these early stages. And it's a good setup for the later stage techniques where we start slowly addressing those things a step at a time. But this is a good foundation. Let's have a look at another one. This is one that was sent through by a student that's studying, obviously you can see cell structure and function as a topic. So we're seeing it's not too wordy. We're seeing relationships. We're seeing some very basic attempts at chunking. We're not seeing too many visuals. So that's one thing that this person might want to start working on. But again, it's not enough for me to say that we'll hold them back. They are not being too wordy, so I'm okay with that. The one thing that makes me a little cautious is that it's very simple in terms of the amount of information that's on here. There's a lot of detail that's missing, and I'd really like this person to start exploring, incorporating more information on their notes. When you increase the amount of information you're trying to represent on your notes, it creates new types of challenges, new types of difficulties that can reveal different types of errors, different types of mistakes will pop up, which is again really great fuel for improvement when we learn techniques to fix that. So the only thing that I'd say is a little bit iffy is that they haven't really had too much information on this. However, it's definitely still pretty solid, and I wouldn't say that we need to hold someone back because of this. But if they wanted to stay at fundamentals and just work on this before moving on, adding more information, I'd say that that's a perfectly good idea as well. This is something that was sent through by another student, and you can see it's again in the field of science. It's not written in English, but we can still see there's good relationships. There's some level of grouping that's going on. We can see that there are basic groups being formed. We've got groups here, a little bit of grouping here, groups here, grouping. It's pretty simple types of grouping that's occurring, but there's definitely an effort being shown here to group information. It's not too wordy. The amount of information that's on this is fair enough. It's not really visual, so maybe increasing the use of some abstract visuals will be useful. This person may really struggle with that, but it just means that we need to train that up from an earlier stage and just keep consistently working on it. But this is, this would be good. They'd be ready to move into briefing. This is another piece of work sent by the same person, and those that are a little bit later in the course will look at this and say, hey, there are a few issues here in terms of the way that they're actually chunking and structuring the information. But again, in these early fundamental stages, just the attempt alone, this is perfectly enough. We can start cleaning up this technique as we go. And another piece of work, again, by actually the same person here. And we're seeing that they're starting to use some visuals, and this is actually a really good visual that's being used. There's some color there. They've really tried to integrate certain ideas together. We can see they're attempting to use a bit more visuals, and that's good. This person can actually do a little bit of what's called keyword anchoring. They should really include some of the keywords underneath the images as well, and that helps to just anchor the picture in. And they may be facing some issues potentially with what's called hieroglyphics, but that's something that we start thinking about more in briefing and technique training. But again, for now, it's relational, it's not too wordy. There is, grouping that's being shown here, and this person is obviously willing to, give it a go and use these techniques. So this is really, really good. Very strong start, and they'll be able to move into briefing, and I wouldn't have any concerns about them for the next couple of stages. Now, this is a different type of example from looking at something that's a little bit more arts, literature, history, things like that. And so it's going to look a little bit different. And what we're seeing is that there is a sort of sequence that they're showing. There's lots of visuals that are here. But what we're not seeing is that the ideas are really grouped together, and we're not really seeing relationships. We're seeing just more of a single process and a flow. And in terms of the relationships, it's not quite there. So this is somewhat a position where I'd say maybe we want to stay at fundamentals for just a little bit longer and start thinking about how can maybe some of these stages of events be grouped together a little bit. How can we start thinking about how certain points of these might be related to other points, and start trying to build a little bit more of a network rather than just a single chain, which if you forget one part of the chain, it then starts affecting your ability to encode and remember other parts of the chain as well. It creates a higher risk type of structure for the information. So this is an example where, because they haven't really grouped things together and there's not too much in the way of relationships, it's not really ready to move on. They're obviously doing a great job with the visuals, probably more than needs to be actually, but these other things that we need to work on is holding them back. But they are obviously giving it a go, and so that's a really big positive sign. This is something sent through by the same person again. They're saying that on reflection, it was very complicated and they found it difficult to remember. They thought it was because of the lack of visual cues that made it difficult to remember. But in reality, it's probably not. It's going to be due to the grouping of the information. So here we see something where they've got lots of things and lots of relationships everywhere. In fact, there's so many relationships going everywhere, it's hard to even know what's happening. So this is an example of someone who kind of meets some of the criteria, and we can actually start cleaning this up. But because they are showing relationships, because they are doing some basic groupings, this is actually probably good enough to start moving on. How they can improve their memory of these things is actually going to be, number one, just spacing things out a little bit more so that we can actually see the arrows and it just lets it breathe a little bit. And when we start grouping it together at a higher level of quality, when the groups get higher quality, it becomes easier to remember because higher quality groups are often more logical. But we haven't learned the techniques on how to do those high quality groups yet. And that's the thing that's going to hold them back. But they're really giving it a go, trying to create relationships. There's some grouping going on here. It's not very verbal. It's not too wordy. So overall, this is a good thing. Here again, from the same person, they're showing, a very similar thing. Now this falls into the same issue as last time where there's maybe not enough information, but it looks like they're just trying to get some of the themes and things together. There's some relationships, but we're not seeing a whole lot of grouping that's going on here, and that's the thing that's going to hold them back. This is all the same person that's shown here. So what we can say is that this person has the right idea with some of these techniques, but they're not super consistent with it. So if they wanted to spend another week or two at fundamentals, just putting a bit more focus on making sure we've got good relationships and groups, then they're going to find that when they move to the later stages, they'll be able to go through it much more quickly. However, if they wanted to move on, I don't necessarily think that they need to be held back because of these issues, as long as they're aware of it and they're working on it as they continue to move on. Now this one, you give it a go. Spend a little bit of time to look at this and ask yourself, is this person ready to move on based on what you can see here? All right. And the answer is that, yes, they probably can move on. It's not too wordy. There are relationships being shown. There are some very basic grouping that we're getting here as well. It's not super clean. It's not perfect. The images can use a little bit of work. The relationships and the chunking and everything can be better. But for this current stage, it's a great step in the right direction. And we can clean up the rest of the technique and improve the quality as we go. But for this person, it's a good, strong start. They're definitely of a mindset where they're willing to give it a go. They're going to be able to continue moving on. And this particular person, I know for a fact, has actually gone on to do quite well as well. Now, what about this one? What do you think about this one? It's a little bit sideways, but there's a few things that we should still be able to pick out from this. So based on what you're seeing here, I hope you arrived at the same conclusion that for this person, they probably should not move on yet. There are some things that they are doing which are really good and positive. However, there are a lot of things that need to be improved before we actually really move on. For the first thing is that it is still quite wordy. And for this person, just the size of their paper and the fact that they're using lined paper is actually going to frame them into being more likely to do it wrong. It's quite wordy. We have some very basic relationships, but there's not a lot. And we can see that none of these are grouped together. There's just really single points being connected with just one other point. There's not really grouping, and it's very, very linear. It's very, very wordy. Again, it's pretty isolated. We've got a little bit more relationships and a little bit more grouping here, but only the most basic, only the most obvious. And again, very, very wordy, lots of lists, lots of writing, overall a very linear progression. And we're not seeing these ideas sort of coming together. We're not seeing more relationships. We're not seeing them reducing the wordiness. We're not seeing much if any, attempts of actively grouping the information and categorizing it together by themselves. Anyone that has a working understanding of chemistry will be able to read this and realize that the groups that they are creating are usually just the groups that were already taught to them. It's usually presented in a group. And so it's not that they are actively making groups themselves, it's that they are just writing down the group that was already given to them. So obviously there's no cognitive load involved in doing that. It's a very passive process. And so we're not going to get much learning out of it. They've got the idea that they need to connect relationships, but it's pretty obvious that the most important thing for them is just getting information on the paper. And then afterwards, they're just saying, all right, well, let's just draw some arrows to connect things together to show that they're related, rather than really thinking about these relationships and putting that at a higher priority. And that mindset is completely incompatible with most intermediate level techniques. So until that mindset changes, we're not going to be ready to learn any of the intermediate techniques. It's going to cause a lot of confusion. There's going to be almost complete technique failure if we try to do that. So for this person, they need to stay at fundamentals for quite a lot longer. You can see it's very, very wordy, very, very linear, no relationships, no grouping, no visualizations. Same thing going along here, same thing over here. And just generally, that's the overall trend. Now, this is a person that actually sent this through while they were at technique training, which is 2 stages beyond the end of fundamentals. As you can see, their level of technique is actually worse than the level of technique that we have actually seen in some of the previous pieces of work. And as you get further in the stages, you'll start to realize how detrimental some of these practices when it comes to studying are, and how limiting it is at being able to do certain types of thinking. There are certain types of thinking where when you write linear notes that aren't optimized for relationships and groups, it becomes incredibly tedious, incredibly challenging to represent certain types of information. And it's like having a heavy weight shackled to your brain. It's trying to learn in a certain way and it's being held back significantly. So this would be an example. We're not quite ready. We really need to stay at fundamentals for quite a lot longer and just really wrap our head around it. You can see that just the process of making it less wordy is going to be a challenge. The process of figuring out relationships, being more non-linear, all of these things are going to be pretty significant changes that this person needs to make. And that's going to take a little bit of time. There's probably a lot of habits built up that's going to hold this person back. So have a look at your work and ask yourself, where am I with regards to my technique? And am I ready to move on with regards to the metrics and the checkpoints that we need to meet at the end of fundamentals? And if you are in a position where you realize, yeah, I need to stay back and work on a few things right now, then don't be disheartened. This is a completely natural and normal part of the progress. There's very, very few, well, actually no one goes through the course just getting everything right. No one does that. It doesn't happen. A lot of these techniques, even just really nuanced things that I might say in just a single lesson, that when you hear it might be, yep, cool, that's just one technique. Some of those techniques, it took me 5-6 years of trial and error to actually figure out when no one was teaching me. Even if it might seem simple, it is a very specific sequence and a very specific combination of what we're trying to do. And if you realize that there are certain things that it's in your best interest to hold off on for a week or even a little bit longer to work on them before moving on, and do yourself a favor, take that time, take things pretty patiently. You'll more than make up for that in the later stages by how smoothly and how error-free you'll be able to progress. If you get to Ascent 2 and Ascent 3 and there's a fundamental error there, you can easily spend 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months just fixing that single issue. That's just how complicated it can be. And all of that time is really wasted. Whereas the alternative is that you could pass through it smoothly in just 1 or 2 weeks if you had all of the other things perfectly in place. Not to mention the fact that if you've got good fundamentals, you're actively saving time in your ability to actually study on a day-to-day basis as well by increasing your retention. Which does bring me to the very last point that I want to talk about before we move on, which is the concept of saving time and speed. The misconception, which I completely understand and I think I should probably make this clearer, is that when you learn a technique, once you're getting better at it, the trick is to then do it faster so that you can then save time. And that is true to an extent, but the time save that you get mostly does not come from that. Most of the time that you save will actually come from the technique itself. The technique itself is inherently more time efficient. And when you can do that technique accurately, it, by virtue of the nature of the very technique, starts to save time. You don't have to actually try to be faster to start saving time. All you have to do is make sure that you're using the techniques accurately, and with accuracy comes increased efficiency. When you learn the later techniques, you learn more efficient techniques. And if you can do the more efficient technique more accurately, again, that saves you time. And in fact, the time lost, time wasted would come from doing a technique inaccurately, which creates errors that you then need to spend time to fix or review in your retrieval sessions and things like that. Speed of doing things is actually a very minimal concern. If you go through the course and you're able to do each technique accurately, and at no point do you ever think about trying to go faster, you will improve your time efficiency massively without even trying. It's basically impossible not to increase your time efficiency if you use the techniques correctly. You would have to actively try to slow down in order to get to a point where it's not significantly improving your overall time efficiency. It's just the nature of the technique. So accuracy is priority 1, 2, and 3. Time efficiency, time saved, that will come without even trying. And when you often when you try to work on speed, when the accuracy is not there, it just increases the error rate, which means that it takes longer to do the technique accurately, which means that it takes longer for you to progress to the next stage. It increases the risk of errors that are occurring. It means that you have to spend more time repetitively retrieving it. And overall, there's much more time wasted because of it. The amount of time that you might have saved if everything went perfectly from just trying to be faster is maybe like 5 or 10%, which is just completely not worth the risk. That's just the final point there. Speed will come. It's impossible for it not to come. You don't have to think about it. Just work on the accuracy, especially in these early stages. And do note that for the couple early stages, you may not feel time efficiency even with accurate technique, and that's purely because the version of the technique that we're teaching you is the one that is at the fundamental level. For some people it does save time straight away, but for some people they will feel that it's difficult to save time or even be as fast as they were doing it before. But again, we have to think about the level of mastery we're really achieving with our knowledge. If it takes us an hour to have a higher level of knowledge mastery for a smaller amount of information, versus an hour to cover more information, but to a very superficial level where we're then going to forget it, well, then how long would it take later to get to that level? We may have to do 2 or 3 extra hours of past papers or flashcards or quizzing each other to get to that same level that we got to in that 1 hour. So in that case, it's really not even less time efficient. It's only slower if you're thinking about it in terms of like the single study session when you're sitting down at a desk. Yes, you may get through less stuff in a single hour, but actually overall, you actually may be getting through more in a shorter period of time when you also consider the depth of learning that's achieved in that time as well. And that's a bit of a tricky thing to get your head around, but do start thinking about that. If you did meet all of the checkpoints, great. Continue to move on. If you didn't meet all of the checkpoints, great. We now know that. We'll go back, revise that. We'll check up on the checkpoint video again if you need to.